What's up, Dragon Brood? Today we're going to be trying something new, and we're going to be ranking a creature type. Mostly because we get new cards that are of a certain type or whatever, and they're usually based on some older thing. And there's always like, this is like the new X or whatever, right? And there's comparisons made. So this time we're going to talk about the Gearhulks from Aetherdrift, and we're going to rank them, all five of them, against how they rank compared to the old Gearhulks from Kaladesh. So let's start at the top with the new Gearhulks, and then we'll go bottom up with the old Gearhulks. Now, for my money, Bright Glass Gearhulk is probably by a small margin the best of the new Gearhulks. And let me explain, right? There's a little bit of bias here, so I'm sure this is going to be the first thing I get flamed about in the comments, but it's a 4 mana 4/4. It has First Strike, it has Trample, so it's already hard to deal with. But the tutor option of it to let you go get 2 1 mana things is huge, right? This is the type of card that the more cards that get made, the better this card gets, right? Whether you're playing it in Commander or playing it in Vintage or Legacy or even in Standard, there's always going to be good stuff for you to go get. We've already seen it in a few different decks, and it's actually been as good as advertised. That's probably the reason of the new 5 Gearhulks I'm giving it a little bit of an edge, because it stands to show up in more decks as the years go by. There's another one that's also really good, and we're talking about Oil Deep Gearhulk, right? This is the one that I think if you wanted to make an argument for another S tier level Gearhulk from Aetherdrift, I think the Oil Deep Gearhulk could be that card for a lot of people. So I understand if you would rank this one higher. It is 4/4 for 4, so still the same size overall. But the two abilities you get here are Lifelink and Ward 1, which are huge. Now, the actual ability of the Gearhulk isn't as good, I think, as Bright Glass Gearhulk, but still very useful because you can use it on yourself or your opponent to get rid of a card from the hand and then draw another card. So if you're digging for something, it's useful. If you want to get a problematic card out of the opponent's hand, it's useful. But I will say it does have some versatility that if you're playing an aggressive blue-black deck, it can be played. And it can also fit in some mid-rangey to slightly controlling builds as well. So yeah, if you wanted to rank this higher, I would totally understand. But that brings us to Riptide Gearhulk. And I do like this one quite a lot as well. And it's the low end of A. Really high B, really low A. So I'm putting it in the A tier category. Mostly because it is a little more expensive to cast than the other two, being 5 mana. It is a 2/5, so it's a little bit bigger toughness, but it does have double strike. So it's like sort of a 4/5, right? But the coolest part about this is you can get rid of any problematic card for basically like 3 turns before you have to deal with it, right? Like that's actually pretty huge. And it's hard to undersell that ability. Now that said, I don't know how many decks this goes into just yet, or particularly what decks definitely want it, right? Because the aggressive decks don't want this. The mid-rangey decks kind of sort of maybe want it, and the control decks can definitely take some use of it because they're likely to have more spells trying to draw cards and stuff anyway. So it's a really interesting card. I just don't know if it fits in as cleanly into as many decks as the other two, but it's hard to deny how good this card is and the ability on it. And then we get to a pretty big drop off with Coalstoke Gearhulk that's going to slot in at our C tier here. Mostly because at 5 mana, it's fine for a 5/4. It does have Menace and it does have Death Touch, so that's actually really nice. Usually, when you get big things with Death Touch, though, it's like, I don't know, what else are you fighting? Maybe a 6/6 demon or something. But even then, they have to double block it, so I don't know. I will say this though, when you play this card, it will be very good for you, right? It's basically get you a reanimator effect for a reanimation effect for something that's 4 or less, which is fine. And we've seen some decks already that will play all of the clones, if you will, that you can get out of the graveyard, then you copy it, then you get another one out of the graveyard, you end up with like 10 of these. Well, maybe not 10, like 6 or 7, and then attack with them. And that's actually a viable thing, but the problem is that's a very narrow use in just one deck. We haven't really seen it showcased anywhere outside of that particular build, and we do have a lot of really good easy access reanimator cards that can actually just get much bigger and better creatures out of the graveyard. So for that reason, we can't rank it too much higher, and definitely can't put it in the same category as the other three that are almost more ubiquitous in their uses. But I don't hate this one. But then that does bring us to the worst far and away the worst Gearhulk out of the new ones, and that's Pyrewood Gearhulk. Honestly, if I'd have made this chart with an F tier or a don't ever play tier, that's probably where this would fall. And don't get me wrong, I'm generally the one that likes the big dumb creatures, and this seems like it would be right up my alley, but it's the most expensive of the Gearhulks at 6 mana. You do get the biggest body as a 7/7, which is super nice, but I don't know if this card's any better even than Overrun. And the crazy part is Overrun's going to be in standard longer than this card's going to be in standard. So I don't know when we're ever really going to play this. The only chance this card has of being played, at least in standard, is going to be if something in the next year comes out, maybe a year and a half, that, I don't know, gives you a reduced cost on artifacts some significant amount. Or, well, even then it has colored mana in the cost, so that's tough. But I don't know, maybe you can get a big artifact out of the graveyard for free and pump your stuff or whatever. But the problem here is that, again, comparing it to something even like Overrun, you get an extra +1 and everything outright gets trample, which is super nice. So I don't really know where this would fit or who would even use it. And we talked about this on stream, that this card seems like it should be playable. It has all the right words to at least make you consider it, but every single deck I've tried putting it in, it's one of the first cards cut. So yeah, this one far and away is just, right now, I don't know of a reason you'd want to use it. All right, so as promised, we're going to go from the bottom up on the old 5. So that lets us start here with the combustible Gearhulk. And honestly, I'm not so it's not D tier, but it's squarely in C tier. And the reason I say that is this is a card that you almost never get what you want. Like, don't get me wrong, it's 6 mana already, which is a little more on the expensive side for what you get out of this. It is a 6/6 body, which is nice. It does have first strike, so that's cool. But beyond that, you either get 3 cards or you mill a couple things and your opponent takes some damage. Sadly, every single time I've seen this card played, unless you've gone way out of your way to set up the top of your library and do all this, like, it doesn't really do much. It's often like, if your hand's low or whatever, your opponent just says, well, I'm just not going to give you extra cards. Or they gamble and, you're just like, whatever, I have 35 life still. And you're like, okay, take 12, after flipping a couple of relevant cards. It's fine. It's not terrible, but it's just not as impactful as the other cards are, right? When you compare them to the other Gearhulks that came out in the same set, and even multiples from the most recent set, it's just not nearly as strong, sadly. And I think we all wanted this to do something, and I've seen a lot of people try different stuff with it. And don't be wrong, late in the game, it's like, okay, if your opponent's low enough, they're not going to gamble for you flipping stuff to your graveyard, so then you get 3 cards. But you could have also just played a bunch of other random red cards that let you draw cards. So, I don't know. It's fine, but C tier is about as high as I could give it. Next up is Noxious Gearhulk, and it is going squarely in B tier. And that might seem a little bit high, but when we're comparing it to the other Gearhulks, your ranking's got to be relative sometimes. In this case, the one thing about the Gearhulk is it does have Menace, so it's a little hard to block, and it's a 5/4. It is 6 mana, so that's a little bit of a downside, but realistically, it's going to kill something every time it comes onto the battlefield, and you get to gain some life. So you're getting something out of this pretty much every time. Now, this card mostly only shows up in Commander games, so that shouldn't surprise anybody. But in Commander games, generally, this is going to kill something where you're probably going to get 4 more life, and you get a problematic card off the battlefield, and then you still have a 5/4 menace thing your opponents have to deal with. That it happens to also be an artifact, and that can matter for some decks as well. So not a lot to say about this one, other than the fact that it pretty much is going to do what you want it to do every single time, and that's got to count for something. I just realized I grabbed the wrong Gearhulk. I don't want that one. We want the Noxious Gearhulk in B, of course. That's what we were talking about. But, conveniently, that does bring us to our next Gearhulk, which is Verdurous Gearhulk, and we're going to put that in A tier. The reason being is this is only 5 mana. You get a 4/4, which doesn't seem like a lot, but truthfully, it's the matter of getting those counters is so big, especially where this card gets played the most, which is in Commander. And a lot of times those Commander decks are playing a bunch of the cards that anytime you get a counter, you get an additional counter. Sometimes there's 2 or 3 of those on the battlefield, which means that when you play this, a lot of times I've seen this card go off to basically add 12 counters when it hits the battlefield, which is huge for just 5 mana, and itself is a 4/4 trampler. Not a lot to really hate about this, right? It does exactly what you want to do. It fits a popular deck type. I mean, it can also make something a big threat, right? Like you can put counters on something else that already has flying, as an example. Or something with trample, which is probably more appropriate because it's green, but you get what I'm saying. This card has a lot of good uses. Not a surprise, I'm putting it in A tier. Next up, we have Cataclysmic Gearhulk. This is a card where I have to admit I'm not a fan of playing a bunch of board wipes, especially ones that reduce the numbers or basically a balance, right? Like you're reducing everything and resetting the battlefield. Like that's frustrating, but this card's really dang good. It's 5 mana, it's a 4/5. It has menace, which doesn't matter that much, but the fact that it basically can reduce down everything and get the board under control somewhat, pretty big. And you can often set up your deck to take advantage of it, which is also really powerful. So yeah, this card, really good, honestly. If you like playing board sweepers, if you play against multiple opponents regularly, that one's making a bunch of, I don't know, let's say treasure and artifacts, another one's making a bunch of tokens or whatever. Just like having one card that could reset 2 or 3 people down very quickly, super good. Now, is it S tier level good? Questionable, but if you're already in the market for other type of board sweepers and whatnot, cataclysm effects, yeah, this is right up there. But you know what? I'm going to be a little fair here, especially because of how often we see the cards get played. I'm going to move this bad boy down a little bit. Mostly because, now that I'm thinking about it, some of the rationale we use for the Bright Glass Gearhulk is how many decks it goes into and how often it's likely to be played going forward. So I don't think it's unreasonable to move the Cataclysmic Gearhulk down to A tier. But that does mean that Torrential Gearhulk is going to be S tier for sure. Like this card, super nuisance, right? Now, again, a 6 mana Gearhulk, but it is a 5/6. It has Flash, which is already annoying, right? So if your opponent does sweep the board, you can play it, get a 5/6, but on top of that, you also get the ability to play an instant out of your graveyard for no cost. And that could be stuff that's letting you draw cards, things that are bouncing opponent stuff, blinking stuff in or out of play, like whatever, right? There's a bunch of really amazing things you could do with instant speed things out of the graveyard. But yeah, this card, once you know your opponent has it, definitely a nuisance. It did get some play in standard for a little bit when it was actually standard legal, so that's pretty cool. Can't necessarily say that about all these other Gearhulks, but I don't know if it's what I would call ubiquitous in a lot of commander decks. However, the times it does get played, it has a very huge effect. Not just giving you a 5/6, but getting to reuse a very powerful card out of the graveyard. So yeah, hard to complain about this one. Maybe shouldn't be S tier necessarily, but I think because of the impact I've seen it have when it does get played, I'm moving it up to S tier. But yeah, those are the rankings. Let me know, one, what you think about the rankings, because I'm sure a bunch of you just disagree with me entirely, and that's fine. But also, what other categories of cards would you like to see me rank? We could make this a regular series if you're into it. Otherwise, watch one of the other videos, because that always helps the channel. That's all I have for you for now. We'll see you next time.